Much like yourselves, I'm also a lawyer, even though I qualified as a lawyer back in the day. It's been over 12 years now. And ever since then, I clerked with the Supreme Court of India, and NGT was recently opened. So with the NGT later, National Green Tribunal, I hold a master's in environmental law and policy from Stanford Law School, after which I joined the United Nations. I worked in Geneva, Economic Commission for Europe, UNHQ in New York. And after doing all of that, I came back to India and set up my own environmental consulting firm, primarily for the reason that I sort of saw myself gravitating more towards environmental policy, while also putting some of my fingers in environmental law. But environmental policy really intrigued me, especially during my time at my master's institution. So ever since then, I set up this environmental consulting firm and what we call the GPODS Fellowship, which is where we look at the intersections of diplomacy, public policy, and sustainability. And the reason why we do this is because I have a very, very different view of disciplines. I don't think that when you're practicing as a lawyer, when you're practicing as a public policy professional, you can really consider yourself to be from a particular discipline. You are a lawyer, and you're a lawyer who should be able to consider everything. And that's why in your 5-year or 3-year law degrees, you'll see that we got almost everything under the sun in law. And it's the same thing with environmental law, environmental governance, environmental policy. So when you're practicing environment, environment does not tell you whether this is a legal issue or a policy issue or a governance issue. And that's what we are here to discuss. So that's basically my brief introduction. I'll also head back to Stanford or Cambridge at this point. It isn't decided to pursue my PhD in a couple of months in this subject. All right, so that's basically me. What I'm here to discuss with all of you, and the reason why I use the word discuss is primarily because this is supposed to be a discussion, not necessarily a monologue that I'll deliver on what we're discussing today. But I'm going to be discussing about environmental policy, and we might know about the polluter pays principle and precautionary principle and sustainable development and all of these wonderful concepts that we eat, sleep, breathe every day. But I'm going to be discussing what happens when you design an environmental policy, or rather what happens when you design a policy under the legal framework which has environmental consequences. So that's the point of this discussion. You are free to go to our website, check out the website. You can reach the organization or me through the website that's on your screen. And we're always happy to interact, even if some of you are looking for answers as to what to do next in your plans for in law or in policy. I'm always available for counsel if that's needed. All right, so a couple of things that I should mention. Srishti was kind enough to mention that on the chat box as well, but if we can interact and if we can switch on our videos, that's going to help me immensely, because as I said, this is supposed to be a discussion and not necessarily a monologue that I'm delivering. So if you keep your videos on, if you can be interactive, that'll be very helpful. Also, you must understand that I deliver lectures a lot, and I get very bored of looking at my own face. So it's always nice to see new faces and interact with new people. Just the one rule: as long as you're not hurtful towards someone else, feel free to make sure that we know what you think about the thing that I'm speaking of. If that's in the way of a critique or a statement or a question, that's always welcome. And finally, what I intend to do is cover a very, very large topic. So it might not be possible to outline or go into depth of everything that I discuss. So I'll just be touching upon bits and pieces of the topic. But I'm always, as I said, available for a larger discussion. You can reach me through the website listed on the screen. All right. So apart from these disclaimers that I've told you about in listing the screen, I also have a couple of disclaimers slash confessions. As you might understand and relate to, I graduated as a lawyer, and ever since then I've been working in the fields of law and policy, more specifically environmental and energy law and policy, because of which science has not really been my forte. Now, the problem is that I read extensively about astrophysics and neuroscience. So please do not get intimidated if during the lecture I give examples from astrophysics or neuroscience. The idea is for you to draw analogies for you to understand what I'm talking about. If you have questions about astrophysics and neuroscience, examples that I put in the slide deck here, please do not ask me. I know nothing about astrophysics outside of what I read and what I listen to. All right, so that's that. Talking of astrophysics, there was a person called Carl Sagan. All right, he was an astrophysicist, a cosmologist. He used to call himself a science educator. And I really, really like this quote by him. Sorry. And this quote basically says, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. Okay. Now, why am I putting this quote in a lecture that's supposed to be about the economics of environmental policy? Because a lot of the time, especially us lawyers, when we graduate, we decide that, all right, I'm going to work in environmental law and I'm going to study sustainable development and precautionary and polluter pays. And now with COPs, I'm going to participate in COP27 and get a push me UN job and have a sorted life for the rest of my time. I might also get into climate finance if I'm interested. I might get into climate policy, climate law, any of those things, climate migration. Now, the problem is that we make that switch right after our graduation, right? Like we've decided that I'm going to do climate law, I'm going to do climate policy, I'm going to specialize in climate migration. That's why I have this quote, because to understand climate finance or understand climate finance policy, you must build that apple pie from scratch. And the obvious question is, when do you build an apple pie from scratch? Right? If someone asks you to build an apple pie from scratch, does it mean that you get your flour and you get your apple and you get your sugar and you bake the pie? Is that building it from scratch? Or does it mean that you source the apples organically, you source the seeds organically and then grow the apple, you source the soil, you source the elements that make the soil, you source the planets that make the soil, you source the Big Bang that makes the elements. So where do you stop with the apple pie from scratch? I have no answer to that, but I do have an answer to where do you start when you want to get into branches of climate or environmental law? Where do you invent the universe of environment? And the answer is this. That one definition that's mentioned in the Environment Protection Act and the NGT Act everywhere, which defines environment to include human beings, water, air, land, other living creatures, plants, microorganisms, property, and their interrelationship. Now, if any of you have done a course on environmental law, you'd probably know this definition. Environment Protection Act defines it this way. So this on your screen is the legal definition of the term environment. Remember, we are inventing the environmental universe here. So we're starting with the very basic. The definition of environment, according to Environment Protection Act or any of the fancy books that you read on Environment Protection Act, will tell you that environment includes legally human beings, water, air, land, other living creatures, plants, microorganisms, property, and all of their interrelationship. Okay, now I had warned all of you that this is a discussion. This is not a monologue that I'm going to deliver. So I have a couple of questions for you in each of the next slides. And the first question is, do you find any commonalities in the aspects of this legal definition of environment? So do you find anything that stands out in these factors that make up environment in the definition given to us in Environmental Dictionary? So is there a common thread that flows through human beings, water, air, land, other living creatures, plants, microorganisms, property? You find something that stands out that's obviously common amongst all of them? All right, that's, to be honest, a more difficult question. Let me give you a simpler question. You think of everything that is environment and then figure out if there's anything absent from the legal definition of environment, anything that you consider to be environment otherwise, but is missing from the factors that are listed on your screen. I'm happy to take the answers in the chat box, by the way. All right. A lot of them are perishable. All right. So they're not immortal. They don't last the stand of time. Professor Nunes with the answer. Anyone else? Commonalities, what's missing? Another thing that I probably should have announced at the very beginning before I come to you, Sarah, is I'm not looking for answers. I'm looking for guesses. If you knew the answers, there would be no point of having this discussion. I'm supposed to give you the answers, but if you have any guesses, and you'll see the guess game becomes even stronger in the next slides. You cannot know the answer to the questions that I'm asking you. So guesses are more than welcome for each of these questions. All right, go ahead, Sarah.
Sir, I think one of the commonalities is that all of these factors make our space conducive for us for living. I mean, it's all of it is catering to us as human beings. We need other human beings. We need water, air. No.
All right, Sarah, have you attended any of my lectures?
No.
All right, it's the first time someone has been able to guess this. So congratulations, but that's exactly the commonality that I'm looking for. Each of these things that you see in the legal definition of environment is driven towards, and there was a hint on the screen, I had underlined it, is driven towards human beings, right? So what makes up environment legally, you ask? Everything that you and I require to survive on this planet or to sustain ourselves on this planet. So water is required by you to survive. Air, land, other living creatures, plants, microorganism even. I know with the COVID pandemic, it's been sobering to think that microorganism could help us, but enzymes and bacteria and everything makes up what we are, property and all of their interrelationships. So everything that we require to survive, human-centric, makes up environment legally, right? Now to answer the question, the second question, so what's missing? I'll take you back to November 2019. I was traveling for a project and I was in London, and London has a newspaper called The Sun, right? And The Sun had this news piece in its newspaper that morning. For those of you who require assistance with this, basically Psyche 16 is an asteroid that is floating between Mars and Jupiter. And Psyche 16 is wholly made up of precious metals, right? So gold, platinum, iron, nickel, apparently diamonds, I'm not sure. And Psych 16, as you'd expect, Mr. Musk, along with NASA, are planning to go on an exploratory mission to check out what's on Psych 16, right? Now, there are murmurs that I heard from a couple of friends of mine who said that there will be some exploration in terms of mining activities as well, not much, getting some samples along. But when the asteroid itself is worth 8,000 quadrillion pounds, that's 8 followed by 18 zeros, then a couple of samples would not do you too bad, right? So if there are mining activities that are going to take place on Site 16, then what environment impact assessment will take place? Or what mining law will apply, or what hazardous waste law will apply, or what biomedical waste, anything, what law will apply? And the answer to that question is, despite the speed at which we're developing our space laws, no law applies to Site 16, right? No mining law, no environmental law, nothing. So if we ask ourselves, why is that? Why has none of our law been designed in a way, environmental law, designed in a way that it covers 99.99% of the universe? That's because for any environmental law to be covered, to be covering a certain aspect, it should list those factors as definition, right? Law of that domain would apply if the definition of that domain covers those aspects. In our case, environment does not cover anything that does not help us survive. And begrudgingly, we might have to accept that Psych 16 does not help us survive, right? So environment, the first lesson is that we must challenge even the legal definitions that are given to us, especially in a growing sort of niche field such as environment. Do we challenge it enough to say that the definition given to environment, on the basis of which all of environmental implication happens in the subcontinent, not just India, is a definition that is lacking in its spirit, right? Now, you might argue, and all of you are perfectly capable lawyers and interested in policy, and that's a terrific combination. So you might argue that why should I have the definition to include things that do not concern me, right? If you get a pigeon to define flight, the pigeon will define flight according to what it perceives flight to be. It would not talk about airplanes, it would not talk about helicopters. And similarly, if human beings are defining environment, they will define it according to what is required for them. And that's a logical argument. But I have a couple of counters in the form of questions to all of you. And I gave this disclaimer right at the beginning. I'm not a science student, but I will keep on giving you these things. And I'm also giving you a cheat sheet by putting the periodic table on the screen. So this is revising the 7th, 8th standard for all of you. The periodic table, in case you forgot, has all the elements that exist to the known universe, in the known universe. And my first question to all of you is, if you had to guess, and I'm not expecting it the right answer, if you had to guess, what are the 5 most common elements found most abundantly? 5 most common elements found most abundantly in the universe. And the periodic table is right in front of you. You could take guesses. I'm happy to provide the answer, but only after I see a couple of guesses coming in. And you'd be surprised how obvious these elements are. So these are not elements that you haven't heard of. These are the most obvious elements. Let's see. Any guesses? 5 most common elements found in the universe.
So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen.
You've got 3 out of 5. What else? Iron, no, that's a close one. Iron isn't one of them. What else? So we have carbon, oxygen, hydrogen.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen is one, that's 4.
Sodium,
Actually,
sir?
no, it isn't sodium. Who was that? Sorry, I'm unable to follow everyone. No, it isn't sodium, Delphina. So we have 4: hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen. And, well, this is a tricky one, helium. Helium is the 5th. I'm not saying in the order of their abundance, but it's hydrogen, helium, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. Yeah, those 5. Now, if I had to ask you a similar question, let's leave helium aside. It's an inert gas, it does not react. If I had to ask you, which are the 4 most abundantly found elements that human bodies are made up of, which would be 4 of those elements? Don't worry, this is not a science lecture. I'm just getting you guys to think about what I will be speaking of.
The same, sir.
Yes, it is the same. So I don't know why. I'm pretty sure, Sarah, you've attended one of my lectures. It's impossible to guess these things.
Sir, I'm honestly like meeting you for the first time today.
All right. Good to know then. You're getting all the answers. All right. So hydrogen, helium, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, 5 most abundant elements in the universe, and hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, 4 most abundant elements that human bodies are made up of. Okay. This is one of those hypotheses that is proved to show that human beings aren't special, that planet Earth isn't special. Okay. You, I, all of us essentially are just different proportions of the most commonly found elements in all of the universe. So outside of Earth, 99.99% of the universe, you'll find exactly the same elements in abundance, right? Remember, I'm answering your question, the question I presumed you'd be thinking to yourself as to why shouldn't we define environment according to our needs, right? So one of the answers to that question is that human beings or planet Earth is a coincidence that has happened. So to assume that everything is about this one coincidence is full of hubris, to be honest. All right, but I have another question for all of you, because you might cross-question me and you might say that you're not convinced. So I have included this question for those of us who follow any sports. And this question is such: if this football field, the x-axis of this football field, was the timeline of the universe, right? With 0, 0 on the xy axis being the Big Bang theory, or being the Big Bang, and this being today, then when do you think human beings came into existence? On the leftmost point, the rightmost point, the midline, the D, the penalty box, left, right, whichever. When do you think human beings came into existence?
Towards the right end.
Towards the right end. So let's say the penalty box.
It's around the D. I mean, I am not really sure about how.
This?
Yes.
All right. Anyone else? When do you think human beings came into existence? Sarah says here. Anyone else wants to? Guys, I'm not expecting the right answer. Guesses are absolutely fine and welcome and appreciated. Anyone else? When do you think human beings came into existence? If this is the timeline of the universe itself. All right. So human beings, and there's again a hint on the screen, human beings came into existence, if this is the timeline of all of universe, at the absolute edge of this football field, equivalent to the thickness of a blade of grass. Now, let me clarify. I did not say the width of a blade of grass, which is about 1/16 of an inch. I'm talking about the thickness of a blade of grass, which is even lesser. So that's how new we are in the universe. And then to assume that we will define everything according to ourselves, including environment that has existed before us and will probably exist after us, is the challenge that I'm putting to all of you. That's the first step as environmental policy makers that you need to take, as environmental lawyers that you need to take, to challenge what the magnitude of a particular definition is and if it requires refurbishing. So at the GPODS Fellowship, the Global Policy Diplomacy Sustainability Fellowship, what we do is we cover various aspects of these things. Do check those out. We do not have the time to go into the details of all of those things. So I'm giving you snippets of various things that we cover. But the question is, why do we do it? You know, why is environment defined according to our needs and MMRD Act defined according to our needs and Income Tax Act? Well, Income Tax Act makes sense, but why is everything else defined exactly according to our needs? And I'm sure all of you know this, but anthropocentrism has been the way for human civilization. And you might argue that 2000 years back, people were not anthropocentric. We've only become anthropocentric now. No, there have always been pockets in the world which have not been anthropocentric, but majority of the world has always been anthropocentric. Now, those of you who are wondering, anthropocentric means human-centric. So anthro quite literally means human, human-like, humanoid, and centric means centric. So anthropocentric means human-centric, and anthropocentrism presupposes or states that everything around us, human beings, is a resource for us that could be exploited, that could be utilized. And hence, that's how civilizational trends have proceeded. If you've read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, you probably know about this. But I have a question for you, because all of us, you know, because we segregate our waste, or because we do not use plastic straws, or because we use steel straws, or because we plan to buy an EV, or convincing our parents to buy an EV, we think that we are ecocentric. Ecocentric is where environment is the front and center of all approaches. But let me clarify one thing, and this is a sobering thought for most of us usually. But each of our carbon footprint is greater than the cumulative carbon footprint of all of our forefathers put together today. Right? So if you think that you're segregating your waste, if you think that you're following the hazardous waste rules or plastic waste rules, remember that our carbon footprint is still larger than all of our forefathers' carbon footprint put together. Now, if all of you are interested, I have a question for you, but if you do not want to give your opinion on this, that's absolutely okay. But because all of us know about anthropocentrism. And remember, the idea behind this lecture is to develop the core understanding behind what or how laws work, environmental laws especially, or urban planning laws especially, and the kind of environmental impact they have. We start with the very basic of ethical approaches, because ethical approaches lead to laws eventually. So my question to all of you would have been, had we had the kind of time, that what do you think about vegetarianism? Do you think vegetarianism, by its very concept, is ecocentric? Or the converse of that would be, do you think that meat eating, non-vegetarianism, as it is called in India, is that anthropocentric? Now, that makes for a very, very interesting discussion because all of us come with our own biases, but we do not have the time to go into that discussion. I'm happy to address that discussion outside of the session. You have my email ID as well. But that's just food for thought, ironically, since we're talking about vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism. Anyway, let's move on and let's bring home the point that human beings have always been anthropocentric. And I'm going to bring home that point through these 3 photos that you see on your screen. I want you to identify, and I want all of you to give this a try. Only guesses, no right answers, whatever that hashtag is. I want you to guess the decade and the city in these pictures, in these photos. You have to guess, and there are enough hints in the photos. You have to guess the decade and the city from which these photos are. Remember, we're talking about anthropocentrism, and I'll make that bridge in a bit, but where do you think these photos are from, and when do you think these photos are from? I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it. And there are enough hints, as I mentioned.
New York, 1980.
Close.
Sir, 1970, somewhere in America.
All right, so it is closer, and it is certainly somewhere in America. That hint is there. I want you to guess the city and the decade. You guys are close already. City and decade is what I want from you. So it's not 80s, it's not 70s, so the answer becomes very evident in terms of when, but where in America. It's not New York, by the way. Anyone? Fashion choices, are they an indicator? All right. So it's 1960s and it's Los Angeles. Very few streets in New York are this broad. But this is LA from the 1960s. Now, what stands out? The point of this game was not to get you to guess all of this. The point of this game was to make you realize that there is an incredible amount of smog on your screens, right? And this smog led human beings in the golden age of environment. You'll see a lot of academics refer to it as the golden age of environment. But let me provide some context. The smog situation in the late 60s in LA, in Los Angeles, was so bad that on a good day, you could not see beyond 5 meters. On a bad day, you could probably not see beyond the other side of your bed. People feared their children would be born with eczema, emphysema, asthma, all of those lung diseases and skin diseases just because of smoke in the air. It was so bad that while we are so accustomed to wearing masks every day, in the 1960s, you had to wear these masks. It was so bad that there were frequent warnings not to step outside because of the pollution outside, right? And people got frustrated and they started movements, and that was also the time, the late 60s, early 70s, when Woodstock and all of these other movements were happening in America. So movements that were taking place. And lo and behold, after enough pressure, you had a bunch of policy interventions, technological interventions that you saw that directly zeroed in on the pollution situation. Another thing, by the way, has happened in 1962. Rachel Carson has come out with a book called The Silent Spring, where she took on the largest industry at that point of time, the chemical industry, to say that chemical industry is poisoning our food through pesticides and insecticides. So this conversation was happening, and suddenly you see that in America, there's a federal legislation that says that sets environmental standards and emission standards, and it also allows states to set even higher standards than the ones set in the central law. The electrolytic converters and exhaust pipes of vehicles were made mandatory. For those of you who are Big Bang Theory fans, there's a running joke in the series where the protagonist Sheldon keeps asking Penny to check her engine light. Engine lights were made mandatory to be installed in cars during this movement. This policy and technological intervention was giving birth to so many things, including jokes that we laugh at 50, 60 years later. But so there was this movement, and that ushered what the academics, environmental academics, called us into the environmental golden age of environment, because 1972 was Stockholm. If you're talking about India, we had the Water Act, we had the Air Act, we had the Environment Protection Act, you know, all within 1.5 decades of the 1971. So there's a lot to be thankful for. In fact, if you look at literature, they divide, even in environmental auditing, they divide this period, the 1960-70 period, as the root period for all of environmental movements, through which, it's called the pre-standardization period, through which all of the environmental movements were birthed, right? Such a small, insignificant incident of one city being absolutely polluted. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is that imagine that you're this person on the screen, okay? Any of these people. And imagine that these movements have been going on, and finally the government has done something, and now there's a larger global movement happening in favor of environment, and you're very happy because you're no longer scared to birth a child who will be born with issues because of this pollution. But that comes at a cost. Because if this is you, it was this person who was now told that because of the newly instituted environmental standards, you need 10 more compliances. You need to install airbag filters in your chimneys. You need to install electrolytic pipes in your exhaust pipes, right? So this policy change for the better comes with a cost. Now, the larger question is, and I'm just mentioning very small costs, there are larger costs. So EIA needs to be done. That's a different cost altogether. Suddenly you have to apply for so many permissions and consents to operate and consents to establish. And in the case of India, you have the SPCBs and you have the CPCB and you have the CGWA and so many other conditions and permissions that you need to take. And all of these costs have to be borne by this person who agitated for a better environment, right? So the question is, why should this person have to bear the cost of better policy when the situation that the better policy is trying to cure was the product of generations polluting together, right? So the father and the grandfather and the great-grandfather, everyone polluted, because of which the smog situation came to be this. It wasn't a one-night incident. And why should this person bear the burden of all of those generations having polluted? And that's the question that international environmental diplomacy has been struggling with for the past 30 odd years. Who pays for the betterment of our environment? You've probably heard about the common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR. CBDR basically says that Global North has a certain amount of culpability. It also has the capacity so to make sure that financial and technological resources are transferred to the Global South to make environment better. But let me, and this is also seen as the beneficiary-based approach. I'll explain why. Let's take one of you as an example. Let's say that Srishti, who's here, Srishti, who's here, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong. Srishti is an extremely capable student, intellectually very smart, academically very sound. Professionally, she has a very bright future ahead of her. Let's say that she has an exact clone of herself in London, England. Okay, let's call her Srishti A. Now, Srishti A, as I mentioned, is exactly the same as Srishti from our group in every capacity: personality, professional ability, personal capacity, financial ability, family background, intellectual capacity, academic background, everything. Srishti A and Srishti of our group unfortunately falls sick. Now, Srishti A gets better in 2 days, and Srishti takes another couple of days to get better, solely owing to the health infrastructure that London has versus the health infrastructure that's available probably in Gandhinagar or wherever Srishti is joining them from. Now, the question, let's say that Srishti missed out on completing her assignments, or if she was working, she missed out on a couple of days of work, those 2 extra days of work, because of which she financially and monetarily suffered, right? Now, the question is, why did Srishti A not suffer and Srishti suffer when they're exactly the same people? Srishti A did not suffer because she was benefiting from the kind of economy that she is living in. And that economy or that public health infrastructure that is owing to the economy is such because over generations, that country industrialized itself, many a time at the cost of environment, right? So you think of deforestation that had to be done. You talk of railways, coal had to be dug out. So many railway tracks had to be laid. So many things happened because of exploitation of environment. And because of that, Srishti A is benefiting from that pollution that happened 200, 300 years ago, while Srishti today is not. Now, that raises a question that goes to the ethics of our main international environmental diplomatic question. The CBDR approach, that global north, global south divide is there, and global north should pay. And if you follow any environmental governance structure, you'll see that every time the argument from the global south, including India, China, every other country, is that we should be allowed to pollute because you have already polluted over the past so many decades, right? So that's the question that exists. There's another one which says that we should be allowed to pollute per capita, but we'll leave that aside because that's a larger discussion. But if I had to put this example to you and take your opinion on this, should Srishti A pay Srishti for just being in a better position owing to the generations of pollution that have been caused before her? What do you guys think? Should Srishti A pay Srishti? Yes or no? I'm not expecting a detailed response.
Sir, like in my personal opinion, I don't think we should be asking this question in the first place. because we are at a point where everything is already so messed up that if we talk about who pays, who doesn't pay, we're just making the situation worse.
Correct.
And at the end of the day, we need to recognize that all of us are codependent and nobody exists in isolation. And my actions, like even though small, do have an impact here and do have an impact there. And probably, like, if the situation was better, the temperatures were lowering and we were fine, then I think we could afford to ask this question.
All right. Sarah, your answer reminds me of this research that's been going on in a bunch of universities. Duke, Berkeley, UCLA has just started that research as well, which is pivoted on the whole idea of climate idealists and climate realists, or climate optimists and climate pessimists. You are a climate optimist and the world needs a lot of you, because you believe that people should leave all of these things behind and get together and do something. But I completely side by you in this as well. But my question stands. Do you think Srishti A, if you were put in that position where Srishti A could pay if you were the arbitrator, would you make her pay or would you not make her pay? And the question is open to all, by the way. Feel free to jump in. In case any of you are seeing through my question and seeing what my larger point is, I also welcome you to tell me what do you think my larger point is. All right, so what I'll do is, I just realized that we're short in time and I'm already 60 minutes into the discussion and I haven't really discussed law. So I'll just quickly rush through this and come and let you guys ruminate and marinate in the answer. You could probably reach out to us and I'd be more than happy to discuss your views on this. But the point that I was getting at is this. There are two views, as you might have thought through. One is the communitarian view, one is the conservative view, which basically says that you cannot benefit from a wrong act and then say that, no, I shouldn't have to pay. There are no free riders in this world, and there are various theories which I'm not going into. Please do check out the GPODS fellowship and we'll discuss all of this in detail. But no one can be a free rider. If Srishti A is benefiting on account of something that she didn't even do, then she should have to pay, right? And then there's the other view of Professor Simon Caney from Oxford, who says that Srishti A had no control over the actions of her ancestor who polluted, who developed, who industrialized. So how can you possibly hold her responsible? How can you possibly make her pay for actions that she had absolutely no control over, right? Now, I am not saying which view is right, which view is wrong, but these are the two views. Again, for a larger discussion, I'm always available, but we have a timeline to stick to. All right, so these are the questions that plague international environmental diplomacy. It's the concept of inherited intergenerational debt, as Professor Eleanor Ostrom has put. Now, the question is, if we leave aside all of these ethics-based questions, should she have to pay? Should she not have to pay? Should the global, as Sarah was saying, we should move beyond these things. Then what is the biggest hurdle that's stopping the global south to ask money from global north, or global north from paying money to global south? Well, if you leave ethics and blame games aside, the biggest issue is money, right? The economics of it all. If there was money in abundance and everyone could have given everyone money and everyone would have been happy, but there is a scarcity of money. And that is the biggest hurdle that faces us all. Now, I'm tasked with explaining the rest of the session in the next 30 minutes to all of you. And this is the time when you'll feel like I have taken the slides from some other lecture. No, this is the same lecture on economics of environmental policy. So just be patient and it'll all come together in a bit. We leave the last discussion on the economics. Just to give you an idea, we've covered the legal definition of environment, the philosophical underpinnings, the ethical approaches, the international environmental diplomatic principles, and now we're getting into the economics of it all. All right. So everyone loves glass skyscrapers. I remember as a personal incident, when I started working for the UN in New York, the first thing I did was I went to the terrace, I clicked a photo of the Manhattan skyline, and I sent it to my family. Everyone loves glass skyscrapers, right? Some of us must have seen some of these as well. Some of these are easily identified from movies and series and all of those things as well. I'm going to be talking about the one on the left. This thing, which a lot of people find aesthetically very pleasing, I don't. But this thing, this building on the left, is called the Walkie-Talkie Building. It's based in, it's in London. If any of you have been to London, you must have seen this. You can't miss it. In fact, even this building it's called the Bullet Building. That's also from London. But anyway, we're going to be talking about this Walkie-Talkie Building. Now, I am not joking. This Walkie-Talkie Building was the most expensive piece of real estate at one point of time in the world. It was an office space in the Walkie-Talkie Building was the most expensive piece of real estate in the world. Honestly, I think the design could have been better, but that's what it is. Glass skyscrapers attract very high expensive prices, right? You take NCR, you take Bombay, Mumbai, you take Bangalore, you take Hinjewadi, Pune, Chennai, parts of it, you take Hong Kong, Singapore, you'll find that the most expensive pieces of real estate usually end up in the glass skyscrapers. So I was very surprised when I found this as a news report. There was a Jaguar XJ parked in front of this glass skyscraper. And the kind of heat that was reflected off the glass skyscraper melted the car. Now, I don't know if any of you are, I think all of you are too young to be pursuing gardening, but I am an avid gardener. And I know how greenhouse effect works, right? Now, greenhouse effect, if you've watched, I don't know if you have any reference, you have these big greenhouses, also big plastic sheets covered sheds. And the idea is that plastic sheets or glass sheets trap the heat inside, which gives enough warmth for plants to grow, right? Now imagine that when greenhouse effect is happening, most of the heat is absorbed inside. Still, the amount of heat reflected of this building was good enough to partially melt a car, right? So the kind of warming that is happening is incredible. And this is when most of the heat is actually being trapped inside, not being reflected. And this led me to do a little research, and I found this. The code talks about an employee that works in management of a glass skyscraper. And she says that she talks about a cycle. She talks about how we build a glass skyscraper, and then we have to cool the glass skyscraper because of the greenhouse effect. Now, when you cool the glass skyscraper, you're cooling it by air conditioning. Air conditioning releases GHGs and harmful gases in the atmosphere, which further increases the Earth's temperature. So you further have to cool it down. So it's a cycle. And then she says that sweaty coworkers are not happy coworkers, and so the cycle goes on, and you keep cooling the glass skyscraper, right? So the next time you're complementing the aesthetics of a glass skyscraper, remember the kind of environmental impact it has. So the larger question is, why skyscrapers at all? Why can't we just have row houses like in Ahmedabad? That's because this has been the trend of civilization history. When there's a limited supply and a next to infinite demand, what happens is that the prices go up, right? Basics of economics. And when people run out of land, the infinite demand and limited supply, they start constructing houses over one another, right? Simple. And when even those houses atop other houses or multi-story buildings have very little space, then the prices, the rents, the real estate markets absolutely lose it, and it becomes very, very expensive to afford housing in such situations. So if any of you is from South Bombay or South Delhi or South Bangalore or Southeast Chennai, you know what I'm talking about. I know that some of you might have studied this, but I'm still going to explain it for the better context that it might provide to the others. Let's assume that all of us own 1 square meter of land. Okay. Now, if the FSI in your area, in your locality, in your municipal area is 1, then the total built up area that you can build would be total land that you use into your FSI, right? So your total built up area could be 1 square meter if you own 1 square meter of land and your FSI is 1. If you own 1 square meter of land and if your FSI is 2, that means that your built up area could be 2 square meters. If your FSI is 3 square meters and so forth. So this is the pictorial representation of what I'm talking about. Let's say that this is what we're sticking to. Your built up area is 1. Sorry, if your built up area is, your FSI is 1 and the land you own is 10 square meters, okay? So that means that if your FSI is 1, you can have 10 square meters worth of built up area. Now you can choose to construct it whichever way. You can cover the whole land with built up area. You can have 2 stories, you can have 4 stories. We're not getting into the BCR coverage at this point. So built up area is governed by the FSI that you are being governed by in your master plan and your urban policy of the locality. This gives you an idea of the kind of stories that are allowed in our Indian cities. Okay, so for you guys, this is probably most relevant, about 1.2. So for every 10 square meters of land that you own, you're allowed to have 12 square meters of built up area, right? If you're covering the whole land, you'll have 1.2 stories of built up area, okay? You can see other cities. I know whenever I post this example, everyone just checks for their city, but I want to bring your attention to this portion. Mumbai. The island city of Mumbai is the South Bombay portion of Mumbai. And the FSI there is 1.3. And that means that if you own 10 square meters of land in Mumbai, in the island part of Mumbai, you can have 13.3 square meters of built up area. Now, I know that you do not have at this point a point of reference But I think we can all agree that Mumbai is one of the biggest cities in the world, both by density of population, by financial turnover, everything. Let's see how Mumbai compares in comparison with other major cities around the globe. So this is Mumbai, 1.3. Look at Hong Kong, 12, Chicago, 12, New York, 15. Singapore is 23. I couldn't even fit it in my slide. But that's how less the permissible FSI in Mumbai is. And when you have a lower FSI, that means you have less built up area. That means that you can accommodate lesser people, right? That means there's lesser livable space. Now, to put this into perspective, I have a statistic for you. Can anyone guess what 48 square feet versus 50 square feet is? You know the context that we're talking about. We're talking about spaces, we're talking about Mumbai. If anyone wants to take a guess, what would 48 square feet be? All right, this is a very difficult question. Let me just give you guys the answer. 48 square feet is the average floor space per person in Mumbai. 7 feet by 7 feet is 49 square feet. That's the average size of, or a little above average size of a human being. The average floor space available per person in Mumbai is 48 square feet, lesser than 7 feet by 7 feet. Now 50 square feet is the regulated size of a prison cell in the US, according to the federal government. So according to the federal government, a prison cell should be larger than the average floor space available to every person in Mumbai. Okay. Now what happens if you have a limited supply and unlimited demand of floor space? Rents go up, slums develop because not everyone can afford to live in a rented accommodation. So people go into slums, and some people don't want to stay in slums. So they do go and settle in suburbs. So suburban sprawl increases. And what happens when you have a Thane and a Mathiran and all of these suburbs to Mumbai? You need transportation, right? Because people will now have to do up and down every day from Neral and Mathiran and Thane to South Bombay. And all of these three things have major environmental impact. So remember, a simple urban policy of designing the FSI of your local community in Mumbai has led to slums, has led to suburban sprawls, has led to transportation. An urban policy having incredible environmental impacts. And if you want me to take you through the kind of social impacts, environmental impacts, slums and suburban sprawls and transportation have, I'm happy to do that separately as well. But each of these have tremendous environmental impacts. But the point of this session is how economics of environmental policy connect with the environment itself and connect eventually with you and me. So I'm now going to talk about the unliquidated impacts of that urban policy. So transportation, slum, suburban sprawl, you can still quantify. You can still think of $10 billion, $20 billion, $50 billion. But what about the impact on you and me? And this goes back to what we started with, the definition of the term environment. So for those of you who are into sports, I have a case study for all of you. Actually, for those of you who are nerds like me, I have a case study for all of you to take you through the example that I tried to give you. There was a study conducted in relation to chess tournaments. And what they did was they saw how the performance of a person dips with rising indoor air pollution. Okay, so if you're playing a chess tournament, they come and check whether your error percentage increases if there's an increase in indoor air pollution. The name of the study is The Impact of Indoor Climate on Human Cognition, Evidence from Chess Tournaments, a working paper. Now, before I go into this, what are the three main things when you're playing chess? Cognitive engagement, right? You're cognitively engaged. Time sensitivity, and I'm not talking about a chess game that you play with your cousin on a Sunday evening. I'm talking about professional games where you have to hit the clock. So cognitive engagement, time sensitivity, and constant pressure. You're playing against someone. There's always a pressure of winning. There's always a pressure of your next move. So these are the three main concepts of chess, or at least some of the main concepts of chess. What this study did was, it found out that a 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in PM 2.5 levels resulted in a 1.5 percentage point increase in the probability of a player making a meaningful error with almost 10% larger errors. So an insignificant amount of rise in your indoor pollution led to you making 10% larger errors. Okay. But I completely understand if some of you are not chess players and don't believe in indoor sports and say that these are for nerds, and that's why I have this other case study for you. And this study observed baseball umpires. Okay, so we had an indoor study of impact of pollution on chess players, and now we have an outdoor study on the impact of pollution on baseball umpires. Now, three things that are required to be a baseball umpire: cognitive engagement, time sensitivity, and pressure. You can't afford to get your calls wrong, right? So the name of the study was Air Quality and Air Quantity, Pollution Performance in a High-Skilled, Quality-Focused Occupation. Let's jump to the results directly. It found that a 1 part per million, 1 ppm increase, 1 part per million increase in a 3-hour carbon monoxide window causes an 11.5 increase in the propensity of umpires to make incorrect calls. 1 part per million increase in a 3-hour window of carbon monoxide leads to 11.5% increase in propensity of umpires to make incorrect calls, and a 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in a 12-hour window leads to a 2.6% increase, right? So now let's put all of these pieces of the puzzle that I've been painting for you together. There's an urban policy that restricts your FSI to 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, which leads to very high rents, real estate becoming very expensive. Hardly anyone can afford it. So that leads to slums and transportation and suburban sprawl and various other environmental challenges that were not envisaged when the FSI policy was designed, because it wasn't an environmental policy. So environmental consequences of that urban policy. Now that urban policy led to slums and suburban sprawl and transportation, which all had a negative impact on the environment around all of you. And now you're losing chess tournaments, not being able to understand why am I making so many errors. But you might be a lot cooler than I am, and you might think that, you know, who plays chess and who plays outdoor sports? I don't care about these things. And for you also, I have a scenario. Remember the three things that were common between a baseball umpire and a chess player: cognitive engagement, time sensitivity, and pressure, right? Now think of other professions that have cognitive engagement, time sensitivity, pressure. Think of miners working in a mine. Think of air traffic controllers. Think of stockbrokers, billions of dollars being traded through a stockbroker. Think of a surgeon. Think of students taking a 3-hour long exam in a classroom with pressure, cognitive engagement, and time sensitivity. The next time you say that, I saw the question paper and completely blanked out, your professor should be able to believe it, because it could be that the indoor air pollution is high. But there are incredible number of professions that could be affected by indoor pollution. The topic of this talk was economics of environmental policy. So let me connect the two ends that we have established by now. Let's talk about this example. Let's say that you're a surgeon, a renowned surgeon of 30, 40 years of experience, and you work out of a hospital in South Mumbai, right? And you're doing a regular procedure in which you make an error. Now, how did you make an error? Impossible. You have certifications, you're the best in the business in India, in the world. Impossible that you could have made that error. But the patient sues you under medical negligence. The court holds you liable. You're supposed to pay 50 lakh rupees to the patient. Now you come up with an argument that it is impossible for me to make such a minor error. You can look at my certificates, you could look at the recordings of my laparoscopic surgeries. This is actually because my municipality or my master plan of my region kept FSI to be too low, which led to slums and transportation and suburban sprawl and other things, which made sure that the pollution index was high, because of which my indoor air pollution was higher, which made me make errors that I wouldn't have made otherwise. So in fact, these 50 lakh rupees need to be paid by the government because they designed our urban policy. Now, where do you lie there? Where do you stand in that argument? And that's how regular policy making has an impact on environmental policy, which has an impact on economics of everything. Now, that's my session, guys. I have a lot more that I could have discussed, but hopefully I've given you enough to be curious about. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, or comments or clarifications that you might require. But I'd also invite all of you to, if you're interested in this sort of a discussion, to check out the GPODS fellowship, which is where 3 months online, we discuss all of these things, and there are mentors coming in from the best universities, the best, so many things from across the globe. Anyway, any questions, and I'm happy to take you through any clarifications that you might require.
So I just had a question. So recently we went for this BSW field trip to this village called Idar. So Idar, basically it has the southern Aravallis. So, and there's a lot of granite mining that happens there. Now, and that's a tribal area. So a lot of tribes, they live in the jungles, and the jungles are protected areas. So anybody after 2005 is not allowed to live in the jungle anymore and all of that. Now, the problem with this place is that the hills that are there where mining essentially takes place are owned by private companies. So they don't even have to pass a tender. They don't have to, comply to any regulations and everything. And they simply lease the mountains. Now, in the past 5-6 years, the temperature has risen to 6 degrees. And the people who are directly getting impacted are the people who are living in the jungles, the tribals. because now now they're not allowed to make cement houses of cements inside the jungle because
Right.
it's a protected area. So, sir, like in a situation like this, what do you think, like as a law student or as a lawyer, what could you do?
So, on a similar case in Rajasthan, there's an order of the National Green Tribunal. I think the order is from 2016, passed by a 5-judge bench, which restricted the mining of Aravalli Hills irrespective of ownership. So Section 14 application under the NGT Act might be useful. But I think a lot of it is about now in the changing times, it's a lot about optics of it as well. So if you're able to bring these issues to light in the larger public domain, a lot of the times the governments and the private parties would also want to steer clear of such things happening, because of which there might be pressure to stop these things, especially if you have if there's no information asymmetry about the kind of impact this has had on the Ravi's, which you mentioned, then it might be a good idea to write about it, get something published, talk about it in fora. And yeah, the Section 14 application or Section 14, I say you could also go under Article 21 or something like that, but that is a longer route. NGT Act makes sure that the court comes up with a decision within 6 months of filing the matter. So it's a more time-bound interest that you have. Those are just some basic ideas, Sarah. I'd love to know more about it at a maybe in a longer conversation where I could properly advise you what would be done.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And sir, another, like, just to ask, so like, where do you draw the distinction that either you're protect, so like if you talk about immediate intervention for these people, because like the rainfall has increased, okay, temperatures are rising, it's practically impossible to live in these huts anymore,
Right.
because so and then you're not even allowing them to construct houses there, okay, and now they have no place to go. So how do you kind of decide what is more important, that the sanctity of this protected area, or the living conditions of people that are actually suffering?
That's a good question. In that case, representations to the concerned departments might be, again, like this is to, I'd want to know more about this before I give out any advice, Sarah, but I'm happy to have a larger discussion. But what you're saying is happening a lot now. And this is one example, but it's happening in Peria down south. It's also happening a lot in the northeast. And we hardly consider the forests of MP and UP at the intersection of MP and UP. But a lot of this is happening there as well. And a lot of it is because of illegal activities or legal activities, which haven't been taken into consideration. But the options are limited in terms of litigation strategies. It's the usual. You can go under Section 16 or Section 14 of NGT Act or 21, or file a representation under Section 24 before the State Pollution Control Board. But I think now one has to be more cognizant of the larger strategic litigation. If you Google for academic papers on strategic litigation, you'll see how the tides are changing about litigation as well. It's not just about your private right or someone else's right that you're litigating for. You're making sure that one litigation leads to a flurry of litigations everywhere, and that's called strategic litigation. That's what you see an Environment Defense Fund or a WRI or other organizations are now doing. So it calls for a larger strategy to stop this from happening everywhere, not just in one place. So yeah, a larger discussion needs to happen, but a strategic discussion needs to lead to an outcome here, not just blindfolded Section 14 petition or something. All right. Any other questions? All right, so we'll stop here. Thank you all for joining in. Thank you, William, for organizing this. I don't think William's here, but thank you all. And I hope that you check out or reach out to me. I'm available on LinkedIn. You can go to our website to reach out to me if you have any further questions. And I hope to stay in touch and hope this added to some curiosity about so many things that I touched upon. So thank you for joining in and have a wonderful week. Please stay safe and take care.